Hi, welcome to another episode of Humanism Today, the podcast where we dive into ideas, stories, and conversations that inspire humanist freethinkers and like-minded people. This podcast is presented by the Humanists and Freethinkers of Fairfield County in Connecticut. Our motto is compassion and reason. Compassion means that we care about all people and their rights regardless of their status in society or their personal condition. Reason means that we use science, facts, logic, and scientific methods to find the truth.
It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Stephen Novella, a distinguished neurologist, educator, and tireless advocate for critical thinking. Steve earned his MD from Georgetown University and completed his residency training in neurology at Yale. Steve is the host of the Skeptics Guide to the Universe, one of the most popular science podcasts internationally, which was started back in May of 2005. Steve was a founding member of the New England Skeptics Society and is now an active collaborator with several leading skeptical organizations. This past May, the second Nauticon conference was held in White Plains, New York. Entitled Skeptical Mystery Tour for a Beals-led theme, several members of HFFC attended this quite different type conference, which infuses more socializing, fun, and interactive events than a normal science-based conference. The next Nauticon conference will be held in Sydney, Australia in July of 2026. Since Steve is not busy enough, he recently launched a new podcast entitled Political Reality with political science, data science, and comedian Andrea Jones-Roy. Tonight, Steve is going to let us in on what happens when skeptics disagree. God, GMO, and gender. Please join me in welcoming back to HFFC our friend Dr. Stephen Novella.
Thanks for having me back at the HFFC. I've been giving my first talk for the local Connecticut Humanists in the 1990s, before the Skeptics Guide podcast, just when we were just another local, organization trying to promote rationalism. Somebody brought up even earlier, what's the difference between a humanist and a rationalist, or whatever, an atheist, a skeptic? What does it all mean? I think really it's one big umbrella. We like to explain the world without invoking magic, without invoking supernaturalism, based upon facts, actual evidence that's somewhat verifiable, and internally consistent logic. I mean, that's pretty much what we're all after. We just want to believe what's real and not believe in magic and nonsense. So you would think that if people who broadly agree on that approach to knowledge, that we would basically agree on big questions about factual reality. And we largely do. But we're people, and so we find things to argue about, like every other organization, group, subculture in the world. And groups split apart because we focus on our differences rather than our similarities. There are always purists, like, you believe something slightly different than I do, so you have to be banished to the outer darkness. And that's unfortunately happened in our broader rationalist movement as well. But, that tends to sort of self-evict the extremist, in my opinion, and the reasonable people, the 80% or whatever, who are like, yeah, it's all, whatever, it's all good. They tend to stick around. But I like to focus on topics. Usually, most of the times I'm giving a talk at organizations like this one, which are already kind of on board with rationalism. I mean, I could talk about UFOs all day, but we kind of all agree, I think, that there's not much evidence that we're being visited by aliens. So I like to focus on topics that I think people disagree upon, even people who are scientifically minded rationalists. This talk is about all the things I think that we disagree about. And this has just been over my career as a skeptic. What are the topics that have caused the most internal disagreement? So there are various reasons why skeptics disagree with each other. Again, if everyone's being logical and evidence-based, we should come to the same conclusion, you would think, but that's not always the case. But what I do find that it's rarely due to a disagreement about facts. Not that there aren't disagreements about facts, but those are really easy to resolve among skeptics, among people who agree in facts, that there are not alternative facts. We don't get to make up our own facts, like some people in this country believe, but there's actual objective facts. And so whenever people disagree with me on a fact, let's look it up, and whatever we find is the reliable evidence, you can quickly kind of resolve those differences. But where differences may remain, one is on philosophy, which is, not that philosophy isn't objective, but there is often a subjective angle to it, or you may have different understandings of different philosophical principles, or you may be operating under different sets of philosophical principles, even ones that are legitimate. You're just choosing different things. Ideology and value judgments, not all questions are objectively resolvable, right? As has been famously said by many people before, there are no real solutions to big, difficult problems. There are just trade-offs, right? And people choose to make different trade-offs depending on our value systems. So sometimes we disagree because we make different choices about, well, what's more important, security or freedom? There's no right or wrong answer to that. We're just making different choices, and that's fine, as long as you recognize that that's the case and don't confuse your personal value judgments with objective reality. Sometimes it's due to lack of topic expertise. This is, I think, a problem for skeptics in general. Like once you have your basic sea legs, your skeptical chops, you think, I understand all the logical fallacies. We do have a tendency, I think, to think, well, therefore, anything I believe about these big topics is probably the correct belief. And we tend to underestimate the value and the necessity for topic expertise. Don't care how skeptical you are, how scientifically literate in general you are. That doesn't mean you understand quantum mechanics. It just doesn't. It doesn't mean you can talk about a narrow medical subspecialty that you are not an expert in. And so we still have to remember, this is the humility thing. We have to remember, be humble enough to realize that if you have an area of expertise, good for you. You are not an expert in everything else. So most of us are non-experts in most things. And we just have to constantly keep reminding each other and ourselves of that. Sometimes people make different speculations about what could or would happen in the future, and it's hard to prove that right or wrong. Like, oh, if we do this, it's going to lead to all this bad stuff down the road. It's like, well, we don't know that. You're just assuming that that's the case. We can't objectively resolve that difference of opinion about how we resolve things, how we extrapolate things into the future. And then the most frustrating category, semantics, which it's amazing how often this is ultimately the cause of disagreement. It's that people are arguing about definitions, or they're using different definitions and they don't realize it, or they're using subjective or arbitrary definitions and don't realize or are not explicit about, this is the unstated major premise. They are not explicit because they don't even really know themselves how they are defining their terms and how that puts them in a different universe from somebody else. Who, if they're just choosing a different definition, again, especially if they're not realizing it, they could be disagreeing because they're talking completely past each other. All right. So I'm just going to quickly go through, this is pretty chronological in terms of like 30 years of my skeptical career, the big disagreements that I've personally experienced. So one was this question of, should skeptics, now we're talking about a subset of the bigger rationalist movement, right? People who focus on scientific literacy primarily, critical thinking skills. Not that we aren't mostly atheists, humanists as well, but that's not our focus, right? And the question was, should scientific skepticism debunk God? And there was a very emotional, pretty big split in the community. And it did largely fall along skeptic, humanist, atheist lines, where humanists and skeptic and atheists thought, yeah, of course you should. It's just another claim like any other claim. Why shouldn't we skeptically debunk God? Versus most of the skeptics who came at their skepticism from a scientific perspective, not really I had a bad relationship with religion experience, said, well, yeah, but really, that is, depending on how you frame the question, it's outside the realm of science. And all we could really do is say science is agnostic towards anything supernatural that by definition cannot be disproven scientifically. And so it was partly that philosophical difference, partly a scope thing, partly a judgment about what's the best strategy, where people equally insisting without really knowing what the answer was, like, no, if we don't separate these two missions, it's going to be bad. Or if we do separate them, it's going to be bad. And nobody really knew what they were talking about. So everyone was free to have their own opinion. This never got resolved. We just stopped talking about it. But it never, you probably all have different opinions about it than I do. It's fine. Everyone just agreed that it's fine. We'll just keep doing our own thing and it doesn't really matter. I don't know that I've ever actually changed anybody's mind on that question. Next one is mental illness denial. This was, again, early on, like in the 1990s. There was a huge segment of skeptics who really were buying into the whole, oh yeah, psychiatrists are quacks, they don't know what they're doing. And they, I think unknowingly were falling for a lot of Scientology propaganda, which they didn't realize it was Scientology propaganda, but it was. Whenever you talk to somebody who was skeptical of the mental health profession, it was pretty much a coin flip as to whether or not they were a Scientologist, and you really kind of had to know. But this is also a great example of the argument by semantics. At the end of the day, the mental illness deniers, I mean, some of them were like really conspiracy theorists, but the ones that were more scientific, whom you could get to look at scientific evidence, ultimately it came down to a definition. How do you define mental and how do you define illness? And they tried to just define it out of existence. Illness has to be biological. And in like depression, there's nothing biologically wrong with the brain, therefore it's not an illness. It's like, well, but that's an arbitrarily narrow definition that you are choosing specifically to exclude mental illness from anything that could be considered an illness, right? You're defining mental in a very narrow and arbitrary way that, again, is designed to deny the reality of that some people have disordered thinking or disordered feelings, and they need special intervention. So this was also a good example of what we call the demarcation problem, because there's a lot to be critical of in psychiatry. Historically, certainly, I think it's come a long way. And even now, there's a lot of pseudoscience infiltrating, I think, the psychological and even the psychiatric professions. But it doesn't mean that mental illness is not real. It definitely is real as much as any medical diagnosis is real. All right. The next thing, get past 2000 to 2005, 6, 7 or so, there was a lot of global warming denial within the skeptical community, which is, looking back 20 years later, is kind of weird to think about because we're pretty united in our well, this is the climate scientists say that global warming is happening, the evidence is incontrovertible, and the fossil fuel industry is funding propaganda to deny global warming, and that's pretty much what everyone thinks about global warming in the skeptical community. But if you go rewind 20 years, there was a subset of skeptics who were like, well, no, this is pseudoscience. They don't really have the evidence. See, they're playing games. It's not happening. They all, not, I think, at random, that was pretty much universally libertarian skeptics or rationalists, which there's certainly every skeptic who doubted global warming that I know of was on the political right, and which is, of course, where all of the global warming denial was coming from. That's important to note, because just because we are rationalists or skeptics doesn't mean we are immune to political identity. We are not. And this will rear its ugly head multiple times over the years. We still have political identity. We still have our tribes. That still affects the judgment calls and the value judgments that we make. It affects the information ecosystem that we live in. That's getting more extreme over time, not less extreme. And we have to be aware of that. Now, eventually, all of the libertarian skeptics that I know of came over to climate science is real and denialism is, a fossil fuel industry funded propaganda, right? They came over to that, but it just took them longer than everybody else because it cut against the grain of their political ideology, period. That's the only real explanation for it. All right, tolerance for pseudoscience in medicine. This one didn't have as sharp a peak as the global warming denial did. This is sort of always there in the background. I do think this has improved over time, although it does kind of wax and wane depending on different kinds of issues within this. This is a fairly broad topic. This comes down to mainly, in my opinion and in my personal experience, a lack of topic expertise. And also an unwitting double standard. The notion is that, yes, there are legitimate criticisms of modern medicine, of American medicine specifically, And scientists don't know everything. Medicine is imperfect. All the criticisms that are legitimate, they're too cozy with the pharmaceutical industry. The regulatory agencies have a revolving door with industry. Yes, it's all true. None of it means that any alternative treatment is true, though. There are plenty of situations where people have the correct diagnosis and the wrong prescription, to use a medical metaphor deliberately. So just because you're correctly pointing out a problem doesn't mean that whatever snake oil you're selling also is true or works or is a good idea or is better. But there are a lot of people, even skeptics, say, well, what's wrong with the placebo effect? People feel better, so what? They were who we categorize as shruggies, meaning they didn't see that it was a big problem. And it was really a double standard. And I've directly confronted this double standard, at conferences, even with fellow speakers. And I've been successful in sort of showing them how hypocritical it is. In fact, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who was a friend and who gave a very nice blurb for my book, I was at a medical conference with him 20 years ago, and he asked that shruggy kind of question, what's the problem with having an acupuncture department in a medical school? It's all good. At the time, he was not famous, but he was the director of the Hayden Planetarium, and I knew him, and I knew that about him. And I said, you're the director of the Hayden Planetarium, right? And he said, so how would you feel if they wanted to open up a section dedicated to astrology? And he was like, I acquiesce. He completely got it, but just because he was confronting the fact that you have a complete double standard about the tolerance of pseudoscience in your profession versus another science. As a physician, I have a zero tolerance of pseudoscience in my profession. I have a zero tolerance of pseudoscience in anything, in any area. But it's consistent. So that's always been interesting, just because medicine's complicated, it's hard to understand, and so it's very easy to fall for, I think, a lot of the "it's natural is good," kind of snake oil propaganda. GMOs. If you go back into the late teens, especially, I think was the peak of sort of anti-GMO beliefs among people who were skeptical. And why was that? Again, lack of topic expertise mainly. Didn't really appreciate the fact that the information ecosystem that they were living in, and this is both sides of the aisle, but definitely more on the left. And among the rationalist community, more broadly speaking, this was definitely an issue on the political left, very much unlike the global warming issue. That in the information ecosystem you're living in, it's overwhelmed with very well paid for propaganda, direct misinformation. And again, I've had this conversation 100 times with skeptics, like, tell me what your problem is with GMO. And 100% of the time, they say things that are demonstrably not true. So this is something, it was due to factual misinformation. Monsanto sues people over accidental contamination of their farm. They've never done that. They have never done that. And in fact, they were sued by the organic lobby saying that they do that, and they could not show a single case where that happened, because it doesn't happen. They sued people who were essentially arguing for patent exhaustion, who were literally trying to completely remove the legal basis of their patent. Now, we can have disagreements about whether we should be able to patent seeds and the system, whatever. But within the system, they were doing what any company would do, protecting their patent. Anyway, every other issue, well, trans genes have safety issues. No, they don't. What's it? Even define a trans gene for me. Well, shouldn't put a gene from a fish into a tomato. Why? 60% of tomatoes' genes are in fish already. There is really no difference. You can go down the line and everything, and this is interestingly that this is one of the topics that you could really change people's mind with factual information, because anti-GMO beliefs are based on misinformation. And especially skeptics, they will listen to facts, right? If you say, well, these are the facts, things that you were told, just because they're ubiquitous out there, it doesn't mean that they're true. And once you correct all the misinformation, yeah, I guess you're right. There really isn't anything left to argue about. All right. Nuclear power. This also tends to be ideological. And this one is current. I could almost predict what people's opinions are on this based upon their political identity. But again, there tends to be more support for nuclear power on the right, less support for it on the political left. That is true for skeptics as well. Here, there's no real objective answer here, and I have my beliefs about it, which I've been very outspoken about on my podcast. I think that the consensus of experts is that we're not going to turn this ship around fast enough without nuclear power, period. It's just we need some way with a small land footprint to produce massive amounts of low carbon power. Every system that says, oh, we could do it with all, renewables and battery storage. Like, yeah, but we'll get there eventually, but that's going to take 100 years to do that or whatever, some ridiculous amount of time. We don't have enough copper to do that. I mean, there are limitations to having one solution to the problem. We need to do everything. We need to do all of the above. But people disagree with me about that, and they can cite their experts and their scientists about it. It's working in Australia. It's like, yeah, Australia's not America. You've got to have a different solution for each country based upon their geology, what their individual setup is. You can do all geothermal in Iceland. You can't do that many places else in the world. That's fine. Every place has to have their own individual kind of mix of energy sources that will work the best. So we disagree about it. Again, there's no real objective answer to it. It's mainly about the future, right? It's about, well, if we invest certain amount of money, it's going to take this long to build a nuclear power plant, and we could put that money into solar. It's like, yeah, but then what happens when we run out of grid storage and we don't have enough battery? It's all speculation and people literally projecting 50 years into the future. And so there's no objective right or wrong answer. It's really a judgment call, and it's kind of like which scientists you choose to listen to. So I mentioned defining characteristics. There's a couple of just funny examples just to bring up. It's always something, as a skeptic, as a critical thinker, as somebody who tries to be scientifically literate, to be aware of the fact that categories are ultimately arbitrary based upon what we choose the defining characteristics to be, what counts, what doesn't count. Pluto used to be a planet. Now it's a dwarf planet. How did that happen? Did it change? Obviously not. Astronomers had to decide what the defining characteristic of a planet was. And at first it was something big that's orbiting the sun, and then they realized, okay, well, there are moons. So it's something big that's orbiting the sun that's not orbiting another body. And that was good. But then they started to discover a lot of those things in the Kuiper belt, and they're like, dang. There's going to be hundreds of planets. That's not right. And that just wasn't aesthetically pleasing. They said, and it's also messy. We need to have the legacy planets be the only planets. How can we do that? And they came up with a new defining characteristic. It has to dominate its gravitational space. It has to clear out its orbit. And Pluto didn't make the cut because it has Charon and other things that are in its orbit. So it didn't make the cut. It became a dwarf planet. Ceres, which was an asteroid, it was a planet, then an asteroid, now it's a dwarf planet. Because it's a big round thing, but it's in the asteroid belt, so it didn't clear out its orbit. So that got upgraded from an asteroid to a dwarf planet, because by the new definition, it meets the definition of a dwarf planet. Does any of this matter? Not really. It's all internal discussion among astronomers on how they're labeling things. Categorization is not objective reality. Right? Here's another one. How many continents are there? How many continents are there? Everyone says 7, right? Everyone answers there's 7 continents. Really? How do you operationally define a continent? Is there one way to define a continent? Why are Asia and Europe two? Even as a 5-year-old, I remember thinking, why are Asia and Europe 2 different continents? They're clearly one big landmass. So what does that mean that they're 2 different continents? And then you think, well, what about North America and South America? Because they're connected. They were connected. Did they become 2 continents when we made the Panama Canal? How much of a land bridge do you have to have in order to be one continent? Is it just Gestalt, But then again, Europe and Asia makes no sense. How big why is Greenland not a continent and Australia is? I know that it's distorted because of the map, Mercator projection, blah, blah, blah. But still, at some point, this is an island, everything over there and everything bigger is a continent, right? At some point, we made some arbitrary cutoff. So there are geopolitical continents, right? There are tectonic continents. And there's no right or wrong answer. We just decide that we're going to define them in whatever way makes sense to define them for the context that we're using. And that's what a continent is. But there's no objective answer to the question, how many continents are there? That is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you and good night.
If you like this video, you might like one of our videos above or one of the other videos or podcasts at hffcct.org. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking the subscribe button above. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep thinking humanistically.